Hey everyone, when I started journeying through the book of Hebrews on Sunday mornings back in December, I told you there was lots of interesting background stuff about the book of Hebrews that creates all of these questions. And I felt like it would be helpful if we explored some of that content out of the Sunday morning setting so we could do some more deep study into some of those big questions that the book of Hebrews raises for us. But before we get to those really interesting big questions, we've got to do some background. So here's the first of a series of maybe 4 or 5 videos into some key issues and questions of the book of Hebrews. First, we'll start with some background today, and then we'll have a part 2 of background that I'll release to you soon as well. But then as we go, we're going to get into really those interesting questions that you all want to know or want to talk about. Things like, what's the relationship between the Old Covenant and New Covenant? An important question from Hebrews. Can you lose your salvation? Hebrews 6 and 10 talk about the people that are falling away. Are those genuine believers? Are those non-believers that are falling away? Good question that will obviously come up on Sunday mornings. All of these questions are going to be addressed at some level in a sermon on Sunday mornings. But the purpose of these videos is to give you a little bit more information and a little bit more background to have a better understanding of how the whole thing works and what the argument of the book of Hebrews is. So here's the plan for today in a few steps. Today, we are going to start by looking at the setting, the structure, and the themes of the book of Hebrews. Then next week, I'm going to give you another video that is part 2 that answers, maybe not answers, but gives some information about the question that tends to come up the most in the book of Hebrews. I can't tell you how many times in the last couple of months I've been asked, so who do you think wrote the book of Hebrews? Did Paul write the book of Hebrews? Did somebody else write the book of Hebrews? That is a very difficult question. And I have some thoughts, and I've done a lot of research, and there are commentaries aplenty where you can look and research what all the scholars and what all the experts think. And let me tell you, they don't always agree. Because at the end of the day, we don't have answers to some of these questions, but there are conclusions we can come to regarding some of this stuff. So we'll start though with the setting of the book of Hebrews. 2 key elements. Number 1, you need to know that the readers of the book of Hebrews were Hebrews. They were Jews that converted to Christianity, meaning they saw Jesus as the fulfillment of those old covenant scriptures, and they started to follow Jesus as the Messiah. But something caused them to pause their following of Jesus. And the author of Hebrews, the occasion of the letter, is that the author of Hebrews is concerned that these Christians, who were former Jews, might actually turn back from following Jesus and go back to the structures and the covenant, the old covenant practices of sacrifices and all of those things. And why? Why would somebody start out strong with following Jesus and then make a decision to turn back? Well, the background of the book of Hebrews that is so important all the way through is persecution. The Roman Empire during this time had begun to recognize that Christians didn't fit in to all of their cultural norms. And so the Romans had begun to belittle Christians, mock Christians, and in some ways, even more significantly, persecute them. And so these Jews were looking up and saying, when we followed Judaism, the Romans left us alone. And now that we follow Jesus, the Romans mock us and we lose rights within society. Most likely, the setting is specifically the city of Rome itself, within the capital of the empire, that these people are so struggling with their sense of following Jesus because of the persecution that's coming to them. And it's because the Roman officials and the Roman establishment doesn't like that they are going against the grain in society and following Jesus. That's why this is such an important book. Does our society appreciate us following Jesus? Does it feel like we as Christians are sometimes going against the grain of societal norms? Does it feel like sometimes it's easier to just sort of turn back from the most radical things that Jesus says and expects of us and just sort of try to fit in and try to not make as many waves? Those were the temptations that the readers, the original audience of the book of Hebrews, that's what they were facing. Now, the book of Hebrews, let's be real, it's a book, and I'm always going to refer to it as the book of Hebrews. But more specifically, it's more like a sermon. It is an author who is writing out a sermon to give to a number of house churches in and around the area of Rome, full of Jewish background believers, And he is trying to explain to them what the Old Covenant scriptures have to do with Jesus. And the biggest theme, Jesus is better. Jesus is greater than all of these things that are so important in the Old Covenant and in the Old Testament scriptures. So here's a quick overview of the structure. We've talked about a little bit of this on Sunday mornings as we go through, but here's what it looks like. This is essentially an outline of the book of Hebrews. Jesus is greater. In chapters 1 and 2, Jesus is greater than the angels. In 3 and 4, it's Moses that he's compared to. 4 through 7, the priests of the Old Covenant. 8 through 10, the Old Covenant system and laws and sacrificial system itself. And then in 10 through 12, and 12, it's the promised land, the Messiah. Now within this, these are the 6 major comparisons that Jesus is greater than these 6 areas. But within these, there's little micro comparisons all the way through. Like in talking about the priesthood, we learn about this priest Melchizedek. Who is he? Where in the world does Melchizedek come from, and where did he go? That's a huge question from the book of Hebrews that we'll get to. But in chapters 10, 11, and 12, when I say Jesus is better than the promised land, the chapter 10, which is one of the major hinges of the book of Hebrews, chapter 10 ends with this sense of the faithful followers of God in Old Covenant Israel were not able to fully enter into what was promised to them. There was something promised them that all of these great men and women of faith never fully entered into. And you may be familiar with chapter 11 that follows that statement. Chapter 11 is called the Hall of Faith. It's a description of all these faithful followers of Jesus and how they were never fully, chapter 11 ends, they were never fully able to embrace, to fully receive their inheritance, their promise. Why? Because though they were faithful, Jesus hadn't come, and Jesus had to be perfectly faithful, perfectly righteous to establish a better rest. So all of those people that were walking in the promised land and in the rest and the fulfillment of the promised land, they didn't quite make it to the fullness of rest we are offered in Jesus. And then in verse 12, Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is where the people were so close to the presence of God, but they couldn't touch the mountain. They couldn't walk up the mountain. Jesus is better because Jesus enables us to fully enter into the presence of God, to where we can really and truly taste and see that the Lord is good, because the Holy Spirit is present in us, and our guarantee of final salvation is in the presence of God forevermore. So those are 6 key comparisons. We've talked about 2 on Sunday mornings so far, angels and Moses. We'll talk about the priests in the Old Covenant soon, and we'll get to Promised Land and Sinai eventually. But these 6 comparisons can be divided into 3 other categories that are so important. Because in addition to continually saying Jesus is better than these people and things, he says Jesus is better in these specific areas. Number 1, Jesus is better in the area of reconciliation than angels and Moses. That's the theme in that section. Angels are messengers from God. Jesus is a better and more full messenger from God. Moses is the lawgiver. He brings a message from God. He brings revelation. Jesus brings a better law. Jesus fulfills the law that he brings. The next section in chapters 4 and following, see the priesthood. And this is the area of reconciliation. The priesthood and the Old Covenant show that Jesus is a better reconciler than either the Old Testament priests or the legal system that they mediated between God and man. They could never fully mediate because they could never fully reconcile God to man. So Jesus is better in the area of rest, or in the area of revelation, in the area of reconciliation, and finally is rest in the last few chapters. Jesus brings a better rest than the Promised Land did, or than the presence of God on Sinai did. Jesus brings us eternal rest. Now, I've given you a quick overview from one of the commentaries I have, was super helpful in helping me understand this revelation, reconciliation, and rest. And that's the ESV expository commentary, and Dennis Johnson's the author of that. It's so helpful. If you study the book of Hebrews, though, you'll recognize every commentary structures it a little bit differently. George Guthrie does a lot of great work on the structure of Hebrews, super helpful. Tom Schreiner does some great work, super helpful. There's so many good commentaries out there that you can see, and you can see them structured a little bit different. I really like this structure as a way of understanding the flow of the book. A couple things that everyone agrees on in the structure. The end of chapter 4 and the end of chapter 10 are huge hinges where the argument swings. If you look at those, you'll kind of see that play out, that 4:11 through 16 and 10:19 through 25 are big shift points. And so in our structure, we see that shifting from revelation to reconciliation in chapter 4, and from reconciliation to rest in chapter 10. That's the structure that I'm giving you. It's an imperfect structure, but it helps us understand and break down the book of Hebrews. And then the other thing that all commentators agree on, chapter 13 stands on its own. You can read it. It's different. It's sort of a summary of the whole argument. But chapters 1 through 12 are an organized argument. 6 comparisons in 3 categories. Now, we'll move on from structure to look at the theme. And the theme is essentially those 6 comparisons. Jesus is greater. Jesus is better. Here's a good statement a simple statement of the theme that I think we all need to remember. Jesus is the high priest to end all high priests, who has made the final atoning sacrifice to completely cover the sins of his people so that they are provided for to the uttermost. Hebrews 7:25 says Jesus has saved us to the uttermost. So this is a quote from author Dane Ortlund, who doesn't write a commentary, but in his book Gentle and Lowly basically is reflective on the message and the personal applications of Hebrews, what Hebrews is saying to us as weak and dependent sinners that need Jesus to come near to us. And here's the thing. Jesus is the high priest par excellence, or the high priest to end all high priests, the ultimate high priest. So what you're going to hear throughout this sermon series is when we talked about angels, I said, Jesus is the ultimate messenger. Angels were limited messengers. Jesus is the ultimate lawgiver. Moses was a limited lawgiver. Jesus is the ultimate high priest, and the high priests of the old covenant were limited in their mediatorial work as reconciling men to God. And beyond that central theme of Jesus as the great high priest, greater messenger, all that, there's all sorts of sub-themes. And so that's what we'll look at in these coming videos, the sub-theme of the people that fall away. Because he's warning the Jews, remember, don't fall away, keep following Jesus. So what does that warning mean for us? But there's also this theme of the old covenant, new covenant. How do we compare the two? How do we live in light of both as new covenant believers in Jesus? Trust me, all that stuff is going to come up in the future. We're going to get there. And next week, I'm going to give you a video that is answering the question, not really, but giving you some information on this question. Who is the author of Hebrews? What do we do with that? So far, we've gone through the first 2 chapters on Sunday mornings. We're into chapter 3. I really encourage you to read it and look for these themes, these comparisons. And then, here's what I want you to do. Ask me some questions. Send me some questions, because one of the future videos, or maybe some multiple videos, are going to be shaped by the questions you have from the book of Hebrews. It's fun. Jess is leading a Bible study on the book of Hebrews, and for the last few months, she's come home with questions that have come up in her Bible study, and we've talked about some of them, and it's been so cool to look deeply at the themes of this book. So I want to go a little bit deeper with you guys, and maybe this will be a helpful setting where you can sit down at home with your phone, pop this video on, open up your scriptures, and look at what is God saying to you through the book of Hebrews. How can we understand it best, know him better, and that fuel of knowing him, being fascinated by him, being captured by the beauty of who he is, will fuel us to follow him more deeply. Praying for you this week as you jump into the book of Hebrews.